I know, but I wanted to say Jimbo at least once.
No, I didn't mean it. But yeah, it's just sort of straightforward questions for now. We'll just see where it goes, see what Bryn's up for, and how much time he has. So, does anybody else have a question for Bryn?
Yeah, I want to ask something. Bryn, would you say for people who have really lazy diets, like a really bad omnivore diet, they would be capable of getting the kind of nutritional profile that they would require by switching to veganism?
I'm kind of skeptical of that. One of the big things that I see a lot of problems with, and like a thing that I have to handle a lot.
My one question about you being a vegan is, how do you deal with the lack of pussy?
Hang on, he was answering a question, and any more bullshit like that, and I'll just kick him out, right? So don't worry about it. Carry on.
Yeah, I'm kind of skeptical of people like that being able to go on a vegan diet right now. Like, the convenience products that are coming out over time might assist with that, but I have a lot of problems, like even just convincing people that they need to have a B12 supplement. Like, I can point to all the literature showing that they need a B12 supplement, and there's just people that won't take one. And same with like the raw vegan diet. Like, the raw vegan diet is just straight up easier because the entire like draw of it is you can just like go buy broccoli and carrots and just eat those. But those are very low in nutritional density. And so a lot of these people, you're right, that just are very lazy with their diet are probably going to fail on a vegan diet. And that's why I'm really in favor of like these things like lab meat and convenience foods, and an increase in the availability of supplements that are targeted at veganism, and like an increase in like dietitians and nutritionists who understand how to go vegan.
One of the things I always hear is that veganism is cheap. And they'll always, point to things like rice and beans and that kind of things. But I don't understand if those are the type of things that are required for a nutritional profile that would be healthy.
So I find that veganism is about the same cost, really. Like, a lot of the claims of cheapness, you're right, they're pointing to a single component of the diet that is cheap. But to reach the same like nutritional adequacy as like a well-planned omnivorous diet, you're gonna have to spend the same amount. Like, buying a bunch of tofu is basically the same cost per calorie as chicken. And then you're also gonna have to add on like certain types of vegetables. For some people, like leafy greens can be expensive. Like, if you're in the far northern part of the northern hemisphere, like
I find that myself. Yeah,
like countries like Norway and stuff, I know that it's difficult to find leafy greens, especially. Spinach is really popular, but not a lot of people like spinach, and so they try to look for things like arugula or like collard greens, and those are sort of hard to find in some of those countries. So it can be more expensive. But like the single most basic, like quote unquote nutritionally adequate diet is cheaper, since it's just rice and just soybeans. But that's going to be a pretty miserable diet. If you plan your diet out properly, I would say it's going to be the same cost or a little bit more expensive, and then the little more bit expensive part can just be justified either with the health arguments or the environmental arguments or the ethical arguments.
Okay, thank you.
Next person with the question.
This guy in...
So I have 3 questions, but they are all related. So I hope that's allowed. The questions are: how many times do you fart in a day? The second question is: how many times do you have to visit the toilet? And the third is: how do you deal with it at your work or in social situations?
So the whole like farting epidemic seems to be like sort of multivariate. For me, I tried to solve it because you're right. I at the beginning of like going vegan, I had a problem with that. When I was farting, like frequently, like on the like every 10-minute level, and it was difficult to deal with in public, or it was uncomfortable, right? But it's a problem that can be tackled over time. And so there's a few ways to address the problem. The first is a lot of people don't take the time to titrate by tackling a overabundance of certain bacteria with an antibiotic. And so there's different treatment plans that you can go through with that. One of the tests that you can do to see if you have an overabundance of certain types of bacteria is what's called an SIBO test. And then from there, your medical practitioner can sort of give you a treatment plan, either with the probiotic or the antibiotic. Another way that sort of helped a lot of vegans is by upping their saturated fat and monounsaturated fat intake. Because it seems to be, and we're not quite certain why, but it seems to be that saturated fat and monounsaturated fat being extremely low leads to a lot of digestion problems. And there's this sort of this like meme amongst like the Gregor camp that saturated fat and monounsaturated fat are just like terrible for you. When in actuality, there's probably a reason to consume more fats than most vegans are consuming right now. And so increasing like olive oil intake or increasing avocado intake or increasing nut intake seems to help with digestion as well.
So about the second question, do you still take a lot of bathroom breaks, or is it just like a normal person?
Well, so me, normal before, I was like on the keto diet, so I would say I was constipated most of the time, right? Like I would go days without having a bathroom break, and then when I switched to the vegan diet, you're right, I had like, 3 or 4 a day. I think I'm down to like a solid 1 to 2 good ones a day nowadays, and it's I can sort of work around that. That's fine for me.
That's like a
XD fart.
I don't. Sorry, again, I don't mean to harm that. There's one thing I want to have your confirmation. I know that there's
Zoned, I think you're on like a push to talk system or something, and you keep cutting out.
She's actually
if you could, like, figure
not,
out.
but the connection isn't brilliant at the moment.
Okay.
Zoned out. Do you want to try again, maybe?
Is this better?
So
That
far.
sounds okay.
Yeah. I just wanted to say that there's a lot of economic problems and opportunity. A lot of people can't afford, and let's say people in America, especially, eating how much money people spend on eating leads to being underweight and also obese at the same time, or within spectrum. If somebody with not much money wanted to say lose weight or gain more weight and just be healthier in general, really, and just wanted to switch to veganism, how would they do that?
Right. So there's some really cheap ways to go vegan that Shadow and I were already discussing. So things like rice, pasta, and just dry soybeans are all incredibly cheap. They're just not going to be that pleasurable to eat. And so that's sort of the unfortunate trade-off with being in a low economic status is sometimes you just have to throw away the novelty to be able to afford the nutrition as best as you can. And so for like a vegan diet, the things that you'd be going for again are like oats is a good one. There's a lot of calories in oats and a lot of nutrition in oats. Things like soy is like one of the most nutritionally dense products on the planet. It's full of vitamins, and it's full of calories. And then rice is it's the reason that the third world runs, right? Like rice is just a staple of pretty much every minor country. It's just eating rice day in and day out will get tiresome. But whether or not the tiresome factor there is justify, like it helps you justify not having the health benefits of veganism or not having the environmental benefits or not having the ethical stance that you want to have is sort of up to you.
Right, okay. Thank you.
How much karma does this give me on Reddit?
Dude, that's not helpful. Anybody else have another question for Bryn?
So I have another one, and it's sort of related to my other questions that I had before, but there are certain jobs that require you to be at your work position for quite a long time. For example, the job of a bus driver or something like that. You can't just go to a bathroom 3 times a day when you're driving a bus. So my question is, how would someone like a bus driver do veganism when they don't always have access to the bathroom?
Well, in that case, I think it would be like they'd have to, if they really want to go for it, they'd have to sort of address that problem like I did, right? Where if that is a problem that you're having to go to the bathroom 3 or 4 times a day, you can sort of do things like intermittent fasting can help with that, or you can sort of structure your diet around that being a problem. And so they could increase their fat intake, they could increase their protein intake, or just titrate down their fiber intake. Because all of those things are going to lead to, you having lower amounts of flatulence and lower amounts of having to go to the bathroom. In the future, I think, for example, like with lab meat, this is another reason why I think I'm kind of big on lab meat, is that would allow them like to have the sort of diet that they already have. It would just be like ethically vegan, right? So that's one option for them too. And then, like, moreover, I think just making sure they go through with like the SIBO tests, or go through with figuring out what is going on in their gut microbiota could help a lot. But of course, it's a lot to ask of someone. And so one thing that I'm big on is, although I'm an absolutist vegan, I'm very big on like gradual welfareism. And so one thing that I would point to that person is just like over time, like swapping out the milk for their almond milk 1 week, and then like the next week, like, instead of chicken, they get tofu and stuff like that. Just working their way into the vegan diet to find out what sort of is the best lifestyle and vegan balance that they could go for.
Would you say that there's such a thing as a vegan balance then? I mean, I would have thought that either somebody is vegan or, well, they're not really.
Like for everyone, right? Like there's sort of a subjective threshold for all sort of decisions. And so you can principally hold, like for example, some people, you can principally hold that say abortion is wrong, but you can say, there's some cases where, abortion might be justified. In fact, like it might be all cases of abortion are justified for X and Y reasons. And it's kind of similar with veganism, where I think you sort of have to take into account your subjective views on everything. If it's going to be impossible to live your lifestyle and be vegan, you're just going to make yourself miserable and end up not being vegan over time. And what's more important is to try to make lifestyle choices that are sustainable so far as you can. And so I do think that there is a balance, and that's why I kind of view reducitarianism just fine. I'm very pushy on reducitarians, I try to push them further and further. But I think that people who go sort of vegan cold turkey and who sort of hop to these obscure versions of veganism are going to have a lot more trouble than people who go vegan over time. And so one of the best ways to manage the switch to veganism is stuff like the 22-day challenge, or just like what I was mentioning, where you just swap products out. And I think if you hold veganism principally and you're just working on it in actuality, I don't really see any problem with that. I think that there's a lot of benefit to be made there. For example, just cutting chicken out of your diet is cutting the vast majority of the suffering out of your diet, as well as a good deal of the environmental aspects. Or if you can switch from beef to fish, that's a huge reduction in the suffering and environmental impact. And so stuff like that, for me, I think is fine. It's just, you have to make these changes over time in a way that you can actually sustainably do them, or else it's just sort of pointless.
Okay. I mean, if this were a debate, which it isn't, I've made that very clear, that I would come back at you very hard on this, but as it's not, it's an AMA, I just have one more question, which I didn't actually intend to ask you, but it might be necessary now. Can you give us a definition of veganism?
I don't actually like giving a definition of veganism. I think that the Vegan Society's definition is pretty poor. The one that we use over on the Ask Yourself server and stuff like that, we're sort of constructing one over time, but it's just sort of in relation to subjective experiences. It's just not exploiting animals in in ways that would lower like well-being and suffering ratios. And so,
okay, I could argue against that too, but I won't go any further with it. Continue with your answer. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, so like for me, veganism is just sort of making sure that to the best extent possible, we are not exploiting animals and maximizing subjective well-being in the universe.
Okay, thank you for your answer. Anybody else have a question?
Yeah, I wanted to ask about, I know you're anti-honey, and if it's not a well-being thing, what way do you look at that?
So I'm really big on this concept called moral hazard, which is just that if we can construct a situation with various outcomes which we could choose to follow, the one that we should follow is the one with the least risk in cases that we're uncertain. And so with bees, there isn't really a clear consensus on whether or not they can feel things like pain or not. Like, for example, they lack the class C nervous fiber that's necessary for pain as we understand it. But they also appear to have like these other mechanisms that we don't fully understand yet, like their octopamine and dopamine receptor systems, as well as their behavioral attitudes that kind of point towards them at least having concepts like emotion and society and pleasure. And so in that case, there might be something that I'm doing that's unethical there if I'm to harm a bee or to steal honey from a bee. And so because it's simple enough for me to just not eat honey, the least morally hazardous approach for me is not eating honey. But honey is sort of clearly in that gray area for me, where if I meet vegans who do eat honey, I'm not super upset about it. Like the things that I'm more clearly upset about are things like beef and chicken.
Okay, well, now I have a few other questions. Because I'm not sure if you're saying that pain would be a process of collecting honey, or if it's you feel that the bees are conceptualizing it in a way that they feel like they're being robbed from.
It would sort of be both. So the process with which we raise bees involves a lot of processes like artificial insemination of the queen, clipping the wings of the queen, smoking out the bees, and taking their food sources that are sort of, we understand them to be traumatizing to the bee. I can post a really interesting article if you want to give me a couple seconds here, but there's some preliminary evidence that bees do change their behaviors in response to trauma, and also change their behaviors in response to things that they deem good. And so just on the basis of that, like, there appears to be something rudimentary there that I could almost construct as pain, or I could almost construct as theft when I would be taking their honey. And just so for those reasons, like, although it's not definite, just because there's a possibility of it and I could have done otherwise, I'm just not willing to take that risk personally.
Okay. The other one that brought up to me was that a lot of vegans go off the definition of sentience as a dividing line, but a lot of the times you'll describe things as in suffering, like pain or pleasure or that kind of thing. So I'm kind of interested in the perspective of something that was sentient, of say visual stimuli or sounds and smells, but doesn't have pain or doesn't have pleasure. Now, is that a sort of sentience you would care about?
So for me, the way that I sort of get to veganism is specifically with things like pain sentience, or a conceptualization of living and like a desire to continue living. Because if I'm acting against those things, there seems to be a direct relationship there. Whereas, like, if let's say that there's like a light switch. Like, a light switch has a capacity for sentience of, me flicking the light switch, or like certain types of, low quality organisms like bivalves have a very basic form of nociception, but I'm not quite confident that it's pain. With stuff like that, it's less clear that I should be invoking sort of a vegan attitude towards those things. Because like you said, although they are sentient rudimentarily, it's not clear that they're sentient in a way that really justifies acting towards them in any meaningful way.
So then would you say sentience might be a misnomer as a dividing line?
I think it's a good sort of simple catchphrase to throw out there, but you're right in that it probably doesn't explain it all the way. And I think a lot of vegans they sort of throw the term out there without really understanding what it means, in like a very similar way to how some people who are not vegan might throw out the terms like self-conscious or sapient, right? Where these things they're not really well drawn anyways, and it's a lot better if they're going to take a physicalist approach to the mind like that they understand that these things break down into further and further components. And so there's things like degrees of sentience and sentience towards certain aspects. And I think vegans would be better off sort of understanding what animals actually have the degrees of sentience that they care about and having a more informed worldview about that, just so they can argue for these points better. Like, for example, one like ketchup that a lot of people get on is like the whole bivalve discussion. But bivalves don't really seem to have a capacity for pain. So why would we invoke sort of negative rights against pain if they don't even have it?
Okay. What do you think a degree of sentience means?
Right. So in the brain, and in the nervous system, there's this type of fiber called class C nervous fiber, and there's also these receptors called nociceptors. And for example, in just sentience towards pain, there's actually sort of degrees of pain reception that we can understand. And so there's like sort of the bivalve variant of nociception, which is that they have nociceptors, but they don't have class C nervous fibers. So for example, they can feel stimuli, which is why when you go poke a clam in the ocean, it'll dart under the sand or swim away or whatever. But that doesn't really seem to be a conscious thing or like a really sentient thing. There doesn't seem to be pain there. It's just an automatic response. Whereas if we scale it up to, say, a cow, the gyroencephalic cow has a extreme density of these class C nervous fibers, which are responsible for handling nociception stimuli and really forwarding it to the brain immediately. And there seems to be like a conscious thought process there that happens for a period of time, which sort of seems to more strictly meet our definition of pain. With other regards, there's things like taking into account the self-awareness. So self-awareness can affect sentience in sort of an adjusting way. And so, for example, I can conceptualize non-self-aware pain, and it would sort of just be like the idea of just being in a vacuum. And the pain's coming from somewhere. You're not really sure if it's or who it's directed at. It's just sort of there, right? And so some animals might just have non-self-aware pain. I'd point to like lower order organisms like fish probably have non-self-aware pain. But then there's people like humans and cows that probably pretty clearly have self-awareness. And so when they're feeling pain, that degree of sentience, there actually seems to be pain towards something. And so there's all these, like, you can just keep on going down the list of all these different, like, adjusting factors, but there appears to be degrees of sentience in terms of how much we, can feel these things, what it would be like to feel those things, how the mind responds to those things. That can sort of adjust and inform how we treat those organisms.
Boy, I want to turn it into a debate, but I won't. Okay, thank you for the answer.
That was nice of you. Anybody else? Finn, Leo, anybody?
Why do you want to reduce suffering of all creatures?
I'm just kind of struggling to like give an answer that just wouldn't be like tautological, right? But I think like the best answer I can give is just so like suffering is just definitionally what a sentient or sapient or conscious mind, or just a mind at all, might deem undesirable. And at least for me, like I have some really good reasons to believe that like moral realism is true, and that utilitarianism on like the basis of well-being, adjusted for suffering, seems to be really worthwhile to care about. And so, if I can make a conscientious action that maximizes the well-being of the population, adjusted by the suffering of the population, it seems worthwhile to do that, because one way that vegans might get here, and one way I think I kind of get here, is through like the golden rule principle, or like what Rawls might have described as the veil of ignorance, where if I was trying to be born into a society, I would probably choose the society where they cared about well-being and suffering versus one where they didn't.
Okay, thank you.
So,
Leo, Taka, anybody? We're going to introduce I Love Gordon Ramsay as a mod for the next few minutes, because I have to step away, unfortunately. I won't be long, but so listen to Ari and Leo control the questions, and Ari, let Bryn finish his answers, then move to somebody else. Thank you.
so, hello, my name is Ari. So, does anybody else have a question for Bryn?
Well, I do.
Go
And
ahead.
it has to do with antinatalism. So you might know that if you have a child, then that child might be vegan, might be raised as a vegan, but start eating meat. And if you sort of want to prevent that, then is it not safer to not have any children at all? If you're wanting to promote veganism and make so I'll just let you answer the question.
Well, if we want to sort of invoke like an asymmetry of having children and whether or not they're going to go vegan, I think that's kind of a fair question. One thing I would point to in this is sort of just optimistic thinking on my behalf. It's not really something that's set in stone, and might go against even my conceptualization of like moral hazard, but there's a vector that society seems to be following that it at least is on like the path of going towards veganism. And so there's these things like lab meat that I mentioned earlier, or there's just people trying veganism more and more, where I feel like it's quite likely within this child's lifetime that it's either going to be impossible to eat meat, or that it would be, extremely prohibitive to the point where, society's probably done the most it can do for animals. And so one thing I would point to, and the sort of usual rebuttal to the asymmetry argument, is that people being born, while they have a capacity for suffering and while they have a capacity to cause suffering to others, in the average case and in the dominant case, people tend to provide well-being to others. And so I think that a properly planned parenthood, where these sort of concepts are explained to children, or these sort of concepts are given to children in a well-planned way, is going to lead to that child probably remaining vegan, or at least likely to be mostly vegan. It would only be in the case where I think veganism sort of falls out of favor for any number of reasons that wouldn't be the case. One thing that you might point to, though, is the fact that only 6% of North Americans are vegan. And so a vegan who operates sort of like I do with respect to moral hazard would say there's a 94% chance that your child, doesn't go vegan, or that you could point to historical statistics of people shying away from veganism. You could say there's a high chance that your child will not remain vegan. And so I think that there's an argument there to be made for certain types of people that they shouldn't have children if what they really care about is veganism. But one response that I might have that's just a little bit more abstract, a little bit more into the meta-ethics and normative ethics, is I don't think that vegans need to bite into the negative utilitarian framework of veganism that many people do. A lot of people sort of bite into this whole practicability and necessity and trying to just purely reduce suffering aspect of the world. And I think that that's just sort of leads them to a lot of really uncomfortable conclusions. For example, antinatalism, or that they're obligated to do activism at all parts of the day, or that they need to give up things like driving. And I don't really see any reason why vegans should buy into that. I think there's a really good argument for other forms of utilitarianism or other forms of deontological ethics or even just better forms of applied ethics that don't have to follow this view that we need to absolutely reduce suffering and that's the only thing we need to care about. I think that there's other good adjusting values that we can have, like caring about well-being or caring about say human centricism, that I think are just fine morally. Like I think that those things can be accounted for too.
Okay, so the context for this question was actually that I found some anti-natalist community, and to my surprise, they were all vegan. You wouldn't expect.
Sorry, you were lagging out a bunch, so can you just repeat that?
Okay, so I looked online and found an anti-natalist community, and to my great surprise, they were all vegan. I didn't expect that.
Yeah, so the two sort of go hand in hand, right? Like antinatalism leads to sort of vegan conclusions, and in much the same way that it leads to antinatal conclusions. And so one of the things that they would point to is it would be unethical to bring more animals into the world, and so things like factory farming are probably unethical. And they also point to the fact that the factory farmed lifestyle is highly suffered, and so that's another way that they can get there. Because again, like most antinatalists, they get there by sort of holding this negative utilitarian view, and then they create the asymmetry, where they just say, for example, that like certain lives are just sort of more suffered than not, regardless of the asymmetry. And so one thing that they would point to is like non-human animal lives, whether it's in the wild or not. It appears that like non-human animals tend to suffer a lot. And so antinatalists can very easily get to the vegan position. Whether antinatalism or veganism on the basis of negative utilitarianism are justified is not really something I'm like willing to defend, because I sort of disagree with the views. But it definitely exists, and it's a clear pipeline that they can follow.
Okay, I hope I'm not asking questions at once, but my next question would be, is it okay to induce suffering in exchange for well-being?
It sort of depends on a lot of factors, right? So what a lot of like value pluralists like ask yourself might do is they would say that as long as the well-being outweighs the suffering, then there's probably a justification there. But that can sort of lead to like queasy consequences, right? Where you say, like, for example, like what if there is a individual who is knocked out and we decide to sexually assault them? Well, then it might be the case that the suffering isn't that high, but the well-being is really high. And so one thing that they try to do is they try to invoke like negative rights just on the basis of like sentience existence. And so the capacity to be suffered by those things. It's kind of unclear how they do that at all. One thing that I might do is point to more and more complex versions of value pluralism until you sort of reach what's called value particularism, which is where any decision is sort of made in a vacuum and you account for all the factors at once just there. You see whether or not that decision would be justified. And so, for example, certain decisions like taxation, taxation seems to provide like a lot of well-being for the population. Like most people would agree to that, I think, because you can sort of have these like state-sponsored like social programs and stuff like that. But there is a bit of suffering because we take someone's money. But that might be just a particular instance where that's okay, whereas there might be particular reasons why like sexual assault or killing are not justified. And it's sort of hard to conceptualize as a human why that may or may not be, other than going down just this really long list of values that we might hold.
Okay, so from what I'm getting from this is that you're a subjectivist, so everyone holds their own values, and that's how we know how much suffering we can inflict in exchange for some well-being.
I actually consider myself like a moral objectivist. but I consider moral epistemology, is like how we might come to know morals, to be subjective, which is sort of just an open problem in ethics right now. I don't really know if there's a clear solution to that dichotomy. But so, for example, in the case of like veganism, all we'd be saying is we have a lot of reasons to think that this is the objective order of the world, and there's probably some reasons to follow it. But like you've said, those reasons will be subjective. And so we sort of have to take all subjective accounts at face value and sort of figure out which ones lead to the least queasy scenarios. And that's what at least the name the trade argument attempts to do, is figure out what sort of value pluralisms can we create where we have the least queasy outcomes, both in a normative sense, which is to say like in a theoretical sense, and also in an applied sense. It's like which things could apply to the world as we know it the best.
Okay, I have some more questions, but I will give other people a chance to ask.
I'll ask, what is your thoughts on the way the Ask Yourself server approaches veganism as trying to convince people of it? Do you think it's a worthwhile method to go with just consistency tests? Or do you think other philosophical arguments should be put into place?
So I think the name the trade argument runs really well on people who are already motivated by appeals to sensibilities. So people who can see things like slaughter footage and be motivated by that, name the trade's going to be really effective on people like that. Because if you can run the consistency test and get them to a point where they have to agree with things that their sensibilities aren't going to agree with, then that might work for them. But for sort of higher orders of thinking, like people who have a more philosophical approach to the world, it might not lead to queasy situations. Because some people who can think about these problems might say, well, that's like an intuitive response I have to that problem, but it's unclear to me whether or not that's actually true. And so, while name the trade is this one really good half of the coin, I think that vegans need to really increase their capacity for arguing for the other half of the coin, which is the whole like absurdity point. They really need to be able to argue why certain things may or may not be absurd. And one way that they could get there, like, is just by trying to like shoehorn the sensibilities thing as much as possible, like really trying to shoehorn people into watching slaughter footage. Or they might just be able to argue, sort of like I try to sometimes, where it's like, these lifestyle changes are already easy enough. We'd be operating on hazard to make certain assumptions. There's good reasons to believe that we should just do this. But I think there's a valid criticism there that you know, they're very good at running the consistency test script. But that other half of the coin, you're right, where there's this other like big philosophical questions to have, is kind of weak there. I think it's kind of weak in all vegans. I think it's just kind of weak in ethics in general. Those are just very open problems, and it's sort of unclear if they have solutions, or if they have solutions if we could come to know them.
Well, I've noticed a lot of people who have named the trade run on them tend to be shoehorned down like a very value monistic mindset, where, you know, if someone's sentence of what they find valuable doesn't cover everything that they should find valuable, they get dismissed and they tend to get confused. Do you think value pluralism, if people start to realize it as an answer, will pose a huge threat to the name the trade argument style?
It could, but one way I sort of approach that, and I was talking with some people about this earlier this week, is that value pluralism, while it can create instances where we can sort of justify, for example, like if we had like a sentiocentric worldview, but the consequences of that, things like self-defense, are kind of queasy, we can invoke self-defense as being, you know, a justifiable value. But we're still holding a sentiocentric position. And so one thing that they have to argue against if they're going to create these sort of forms of value pluralism is why we shouldn't hold certain types of pain sentience or certain types of conceptualizations of life at all. And why we should sort of just hand wave those away and create incredibly simple forms of value pluralism that ignore things that are pretty clearly in front of us. And so, like, one thing I think that you've mentioned before is that, like, the name the trait name, you're right, it forces people into thinking monistically. I think a better name would be name the traits, or just name the values, or just maybe even just say, can you justify why you act this way and towards humans and not this way towards animals?
I agree. That's also part of the dialogue tree that he has, where he says, does the trait or traits justify the point that causes the difference? But it does it justify the points plural? Because they don't even think of it in that way.
Right. Like, those are sort of just, like, open questions that have to be posed to vegans and to non-vegans alike. Is like value pluralism, like the whole idea of like value monism. It seems to work out really nicely normatively, but veganism is like an applied ethical question, and in applied ethical questions, it's very easy to sort of just start adding these values plurally, and I think that there's good reasons to do that. And so while there might be the consequence that some people
do that too.
Absolutely they do. Like we do that, for example, like in the cases of like crop deaths, right? Like we say that certain types of crop deaths are justifiable for X and Y reasons, even though we have a sentiocentric position. Mm-hmm. And while there might be very good reasons to justify the crop deaths, but not be able to justify, factory farm deaths, there does seem to be like an attempt there at adding extra values. I don't really see why that's wrong, though. Like, I think that answer or that response is open to both the vegan and the carnist equally. The only thing is they're just going to have to justify why they invoke that value, or they're going to have to justify the sort of positions that value might lead them to. But I think it's good to sort of invoke these extra values on an applied level, at least. There's a lot of reasons to believe that value pluralism works there.
Okay, cool. I have just one more quickie question for you. Are you kind of equating veganism with an argument against factory farming? Because I caught a little bit of a hint of that in your response there.
I wouldn't equate them, but I think it's safe to say that most vegans, or at least like the vast majority of vegans, are gonna have the same conclusion about factory farming.
Mm-hmm. So it's not a position against killing animals in order to eat them. It's a position against just factory farming. I mean, I wouldn't have thought you'd agree with that.
I'm just gonna go do something real quick. I'll be right back.
Yeah, no problem. So, who wants to go next for a question for Bryn when he returns? Does anybody have one?
I'm just doing something real quick, so I won't be here for a bit.
Alright, no worries.
My question would be how he knows that his morals are objective. So I'm wondering that if he comes back, I'll ask, I guess.
Yeah, he will be back. He's just had to nip off to do something very quickly. Shadow Starshine, did you finish your line of questioning there for the time being?
I mean, I could ask more, but I don't want to hog.
Yeah, no, it's fine. Just for the time being. Perhaps we'll have Denise go next with another question, then perhaps we'll return to you. Yeah. And if anybody else wants to go, then they will be free to go. I think Bryn has a reasonable amount of time to give us this evening. Well, evening for me. So I don't think we're short on time.
Yeah, I was a little bit confused with what he was saying about him being a moral objectivist, but then he said that it's based on subjectivity, which confused me a little bit. I don't know.
Yeah, it's.
Well, that's the position also that perspective philosophy is going to be taking for the debate. He would say that that what is good for us is relative, but getting to it is through objective means, as in it's through knowledge of each other.
That was actually Harris's argument. Yeah, I'd agree with that, but I wouldn't call that moral objectivism. I don't know.
Yeah.
Hey, sorry, I just had a phone call. I'm back now.
Yeah, that's okay, no problem. I think we agreed that Denise had another question for you, so he's going to ask that, and then once you're finished responding, I think Shadow Starshine wanted to come back with another one. So, go ahead.
Absolutely.
So, before I ask my question, I'm going to give 2 examples of possible moral objectivism. The first one is that there is a God, and the God basically says that something is moral, and by that rate it is moral. The second one is that there is some kind of universal law, like the law of karma, and we can observe people doing actions and getting karma points for it. And those 2 I would consider objective. It's a separate talking point on whether we actually have objective morals, but I would like to hear how your morals are objective. In what way do they have objectivity to them instead of just subjectivity?
So I kind of got at this earlier in that I'm what's called like a moral non-naturalist, which is that there are non-natural abstract facts about the universe, sort of like we almost view logic or mathematics or physics, that just sort of exist. They're at least descriptive, and they might be prescriptive. It's kind of hard to tell. But the problem is that we don't really have any good way to know about that, because what non-natural means is that there's no real sensory way to get to these things. We just sort of have to conceptualize them, or we'd have to discover them in some other way. And it's unclear how we'd go about doing that. And the sort of problem that's posed by that view is that epistemics really do appear to be subjective. So the thoughts that we have and the ways that we can come to know things kind of tend to be subjective, at least for the most part, unless things are what's called like analytic truths. So things like A equals A, that appears to be not subjective. That just appears to be true just in virtue of its definition. But morality doesn't really seem to have that same value. It does appear to be what's called like a synthetic or a priori truth. And so it appears to be informative, and it appears to be true regardless of us measuring it. But it's kind of unclear how we might come to know it. Whether or not that's a problem is sort of a really fun discussion that moral philosophers are having right now. One thing that I might point to is that even if like epistemology is subjective and morality is objective, all that really collapses down to is moral subjectivity. And I think if we're just going to say that's just moral subjectivity, it's still fine to have the vegan debate. It would less be us having discussions about what facts we can come to know. It would just be the discussion about facts that we want to hold. And I think that's fine. Like, I don't think that hurts the vegan position in any meaningful way. One thing that you could lob, if it's just going to be moral subjectivism, is that all we're really doing is emoting at each other. And so it's kind of impossible to like contradict someone else's moral view. But it might be possible to just shift someone's views. And I think that that's fine. Like it's why things like appeal to sensibilities exist.
Okay, thank you, Bryn, for your answer. Sorry, I was just replying to the chat there. I think, unless somebody else wants to go, I think Starshine had a follow-up to what he was asking before, perhaps a different question.
actually sort of answered it. I was going to ask between descriptivism and prescriptivism. And he kind of answered that.
Okay. I'd also like to welcome Ethical Vegetable to the chat, because I know he's also a member over in the Ask Yourself server. So, Ethical Vegetable, are you able to hear us? Because you're on mute. You are able, okay.
Yeah.
That's all right. Did you have a question, or are you just listening?
No, I just listen. I'm learning to listen a lot more using this.
That's all right.
Awesome.
Not a problem.
That's great.
We're very fond of Ethical Vegetable over on the server. He's a
we're quite fond of him here too. Galim, you spoke briefly there. Did you perhaps have a question?
No.
And apologies if I fucked your name up.
Nah.
I'll ask a
Keep
question.
on rolling and rocking.
I have a question, but it's just because I don't think I really understood what was saying. I was just going to ask for clarification.
Right. What would you like clarified?
When you say that morality is objective in a sense, are you talking about the methods of achieving a certain goal or the goal itself? Like, are you saying that well-being for like conscious creatures is the moral goal objectively, and people that have a different opinion are just wrong on that?
Mm-hmm. That's sort of the view in non-naturalism, is that there's just a fact about the universe that, for example, that people should be vegan. And then the ways that we can come to know that, or the ways that we might go about that, have different degrees of truth to them themselves. And so whether it's, fully ethical to be, say, like raw vegan, or it's fully ethical to, not eat honey, it is just a fact of the universe, but it's kind of hard for us to know.
Okay. I have a follow-up question.
Go on. You might as well ask it now.
What would your definition of morality be? Because I would say it was principles concerning the differences between right and wrong. So would your definition include a value, or would it be similar to that?
That sort of grasps what morality is trying to do. All morality is trying to do is, at its basis, describe what we ought to do. And so there's a variety of fields in moral philosophy. There's meta-ethical morality discussions, which are just sort of the idea of what does it mean to say something ought be done, how could we come to know it, and stuff like that. And so in that regard, my view is that morality is objective, so it's a fact about the universe, and it doesn't really care what we think. People can be wrong about moral facts, but I also think that we would have a very difficult time coming to know them, or that it isn't just something that we intuitively know, it's something that we could maybe learn over time with varying degrees of success. And then the other view that I hold is what's called particularism, or like extreme value pluralism, which is that reducing morality down to one value or one principle seems pretty faulty, because it leads to a lot of scenarios that at least intuitively we seem to reject. And so I think that there's really good reasons to accept multiple values into any one normative system, and maybe even just reject values altogether, and just say that things are particularly true or false, and that we could come to know that in some way. And then there's the descriptive ethics, which is, we could describe like what's going on right now. And we could say, the world views that veganism is good or bad right now. That's not a super interesting conversation. Probably the conversation most people are interested in, or like your average person is going to be interested in, is what's called prescriptive ethics, which is us discussing, should murder be bad? Like, could we say that killing a human being is a bad thing, and how could we say that? And then, like the case of veganism, it's should like animals have rights? Should honey be consumed? Should we use factory farming? Is permaculture justifiable? These are all prescriptive ethical questions.
Okay. I don't want to hog the questions. So.
No problem. Anybody else?
I was going to ask, so there are some pretty good debaters on the Ask Yourself server, but I was wondering, do you consider a lot of the people who listen in to absorb a lot of the toxicity that comes from that server without learning a lot of arguments, and then kind of go out into the YouTube world and just only seem to spew out the toxicity? Do you think that's a thing, and do you think it's a problem that needs to be addressed?
At least like privately, I think so. So like I think that for example, I think the name the trade argument's really good. If we could fix some of the like linguistic and foundational issues that we've talked about before. But I think you're right, where people that just sort of listen in on these conversations, they get really good at running a script, right? And I don't think that running a script does us any service, because if people can create sort of novel views against that script, then that script is going to fail. And if it's the case that, objectively we should be, giving animals rights, then it's also objectively true that having a script that fails is going to be bad, because it's going to push people away from veganism and whatnot. And so I'm always very big on people not just running a script, but at least understanding why the certain things are said, or why certain views are held. And instead of just running the standard reductios on any one position, try to see if they can conceptualize reductios themselves.
But I was more wondering about a lot of the toxic behavior that comes out, just calling people idiots, or they have non-rational positions, or kind of things like that.
Yeah, I'm personally very against that. I think that debate etiquette is pretty important, and I think a lot of the sort of the cases where a lot of people in that server just sort of lead into ad hom is just totally not useful. Calling people absurd, it has a use case theoretically, but if you're just telling people that they're absurd, or you're just telling people that they're idiots, or you're just telling people that they're murderers, a lot of that just sounds to me like just begging the question against them, and it just sort of sounds really unproductive. And so a lot of people over there, they mention, and I find this kind of weird, they say that I have a lot of patience, or I have a lot of sympathy for carnists, and I don't really know why that's weird. I think that all of us subjectively are trying to find the answers, and I don't think any one person is being wrong, or in most cases they're definitely not being psychopathic. It's very rare to have a carnist show up and say, I'm aware of all these facts about animals, but I really, really, really enjoy watching them be tortured. That's a very rare view, and that can be called out when that happens. But when people show up and they say, well, I'm kind of critical of things like consciousness on a philosophical level, it's kind of improper to say that person's idiotic, or it's kind of improper to say that person's psychopathic. That person probably has legitimate criticisms of the concept of consciousness, or the concept of sentience. And so you're right, I think that there definitely needs to be some work done in the vegan community to sort of figure out what sort of ways we should talk to people and how we should approach these issues. That's why I'm very big on people understanding the underlying philosophy and understanding the underlying facts, and so that they can speak in a way that isn't presumptuous about the other person's intentions. They can just relay the facts and relay the arguments and sort of have a good discourse with the other. Because that's the entire point of philosophy and of philosophical discussions, is to sort of get closer to the truth in a subjective way.
I think that's a very honest answer from you, Bryn. I appreciate that. It's very reasonable. I do have one other question before I shut up for another period of time. If I were able to demonstrate to you that I eat animal products every single day, and yet I'm responsible for less deaths than you are, what would you say to that?
Well, I would be interested in the math, and I think that again, my view is, for example, that we should be trying to minimize those things. And so if you had evidence of that, I would be interested in that. That to me would be really good evidence that maybe I should adopt your lifestyle. Because if I value these things, I don't know why I would throw it away. There's some really good arguments, for example, that fish consumption, for example, might minimize suffering and deaths the most. And so it might be the case that like vegans are acting on pain of their values by not being pesco-vegetarians, for example.
Yeah, I mean, like my main approach is to. Sorry, was somebody else speaking? Did I cut somebody else?
No, I was just saying, Bryn, hold on to your ass. Wait for this one. Let's see what he has.
No, we're not turning this into a debate. It's just a follow-up question.
I know. And I just think it's interesting. What you told me is interesting.
Yeah. So, I mean, I wouldn't take the fish route because I don't think that necessarily develops into a successful argument. But my position is that the food that I eat, it involves, I would say almost always, animal products, at least to some extent. And I'm pretty confident in saying that I could prove that provided you're following a normal vegetarian diet, a vegan diet, I beg your pardon, unless you're a massive exception to the rules, I am responsible for the less deaths of animals than you are.
Yeah, I mean, if that sort of line of evidence follows, then there would be no reason why, like a standard vegan, and for myself specifically, wouldn't follow that and adopt that lifestyle. Like, that seems to be in accordance with my principles. The thing is I've never seen an argument like that yet.
Okay. Yeah, this is why I was very, very interested to talk to you. But like I say, I promised I wouldn't turn this into a debate. So over to anybody else who has questions.
So I have some fitness and eating, I guess, athlete-related questions. You said you worked out in some way, and my question is, does that make you consume more calories, and does it not go against the vegan principle of inflicting as little harm as possible? You could eat less calories, and that would require less farmland, which would require less deforestation, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a negative utilitarian, right? So while most vegans would have to agree to something like that if you really press them on their negative utilitarian stance, I have values towards well-being and even egoistic development that, for me, I'm fine with holding. Like the reductios on those positions that I'm okay with. And so, for example, things like personal physical development, I'm just sort of okay with. But there are reasons why I don't think that the increased caloric intake, and it isn't actually increased, like, right now, I'm just sort of staying at the same body weight, and I'm fine with that. But there's reasons why we can justify those things. Whereas I think you're right that some vegans would have to bite down on the fact that that is unethical or that is unnecessary. But one thing I might also point to is, even if that is the case, that like those things are unethical or that those things are unnecessary, there's sort of this big hop between normative ethics, so the things that we principally hold, and applied ethics, which is like the things that we actually do. And so what I would say is that most vegans, at least as far as they understand, they reduce suffering for the most part. And so like things like cutting beef and chicken out of their diet reduces a lot of suffering. And they might just say that, you know, me taking in the extra 500 calories a day, like that might cause like one 10,000th of a field mouse to die. But while that's wrong of me, it's not so wrong that I'm going to be motivated against it.
So you would actually have mice die in exchange for, I guess, bigger muscle.
See, like I have reasons why I'm okay with that principally. But what I would also say is, even if I was principally against it, the argument like that would just descend into tu quoque, because it's still going to be the case that veganism is principally right. There's ways that we could become more vegan, and that this little bit I'm just not going to be able to be motivated against. But I can be motivated against things like eating beef and chicken. And so, like, while it is wrong for me to sacrifice field mice at the cost of mussels, it's just something I'm not going to be motivated against. And I think that answer is available to me.
I have a question real quick. So if people choose not to, for a morality, like not buying it supermarket or at a local shop or whatever, I know maybe like I don't really know much about this, but wouldn't they still slaughter animals anyway, even if we don't eat it, because a lot of other people still eat it?
So this is like the summation argument that I hear a lot, where it's like the individual component that I would add is just so infinitesimal that it's not even worth caring about. And while that might be true to a degree, like it's not going to be the case that you going vegan solves the animal problem. It is the case that summatively, or at least like to an appreciable amount, like a large group of individuals can help the problem in a meaningful way, or to solve the problem altogether. And so if it's your ethical obligation to go vegan, justifying it with the fact that it's not going to change the world in any meaningful way is not actually a strong argument, because it requires all of the individuals who have that obligation working together, or at least a significant portion of the individuals with that obligation working together to carry out that actual obligation. The one argument that like might be lobbied against that would be like a tragedy of the commons type argument, but I think that in and of itself is more of a criticism against like human motivations than it is against the truthiness of veganism. And so that's just sort of like it's a discussion that's just sort of besides the point, principally, even though it might be an interesting one on the applied level. But it's not really interesting to talk about applied ethics until we have some form of agreement, or at least some form of understanding on the principle level.
Right, okay. And I have one more question. Would you say, what if somebody wanted to, and they, would you say that is healthy to eat?
Sorry, you're just cutting in and out a little bit. I can't quite get what you're asking.
Okay, sorry, hold on. Is this better?
Yep.
Okay. I know, in some ways that veganism is healthy for you, but because of those supplements and things like that, could you in some kind of way be like vegan, but not exactly? Like you could eat mostly vegetables, but you eat like meat to supplement some of the protein.
Mm-hmm. Like that is available to you. Like that's the dietary recommendations that are coming out now are effectively that, where it's like your diet should be on the order of like 70 to like 80% plant based, and then if you want to add meat in there, that's good too. What you have to understand when you make decisions like that is that there isn't really like a healthy amount of cholesterol intake, and there kind of just isn't really a healthy amount of saturated fat intake for the most part. Like those things together tend to reduce your lifespan. Now, one thing you might be able to do is say, well, if I'm only having like, a single steak a week, that's going to reduce my lifespan by maybe like a year, but the 79 years that I'm going to have anyways will be more pleasurable. And so if you're just a health vegan, I think it's available to you to just say like a certain amount of steak is justifiable. And then the one thing that you just want to point to is just go look at the evidence and just go see what the dose-dependent response curve is for these sort of nutrients, and just say, okay, well, this is the amount that I can justify. Or one thing that you might want to like look into in the future is, again, like things like lab meat or things like really convincing mock meats that can provide you that taste pleasure and also provide you the nutrition, but not at the cost of your health.
Right, okay. I have one more question. Sorry about that. I know that people say that morally, killing animals is wrong. A lot of veganists, and some of them aren't. Some of them go, as you said, just for vegetables like that, to be healthier. Would you say, why would you think that people find killing animals morally wrong? Not for the pain level of animals, but just killing them in general. Like, why do you think?
Well, I think one thing that they would do, and so most people do this, is they sort of invoke the golden rule, right? Like, things that I wouldn't want to happen to me, I'm not going to do to others. And so one thing that, like, some people can say is, like, if you don't believe in the view that these animals have some degree of capacitance for understanding that they're alive and that they want to continue living, just go and try and hold your pet cat under the bathwater for like an hour. Just try and drown your cat and see if your cat's going to be okay with that. And you can also repeat that experiment with cows. And we can also just repeat that experiment even more theoretically by just looking at their brain structures and whatnot. And what's sort of available to us is that there's at least enough evidence for most vegans to be careful about killing these animals. Because it appears that they do not want to die, that they have the brain and nervous structures responsible for not wanting to die. And if that's the case, then there's really no difference there between, say, a human and a cow in not wanting to die. And if we don't want to kill people because we don't want to die, then we should also extend that to animals. Regardless of if it's like a painless death. Like most people don't want to be euthanized. Like, most people want to continue living. Even though euthanization wouldn't be painful, it's just like it's weird for them to conceptualize what it would be like to just be killed. And if we're going to be weird about that, then we should be weird about killing animals as well. Or at least weird about killing most animals that have the ability to conceptualize these things.
Right, okay. Thank you so much.
Does anybody else have a question?
So, how do you feel about the idea that when you quit veganism, people will say that you were never vegan because your original reason for becoming vegan was health, and basically your ethical beliefs that you picked up along the way don't matter because your reason for becoming vegan in the first place was health.
Yeah, I just think that's deplorable. Like, I don't see any reason to say that. Like, people's values change, and it's very difficult to say that we have an objective standard, right? And so I don't really see any reason to bother people like that. I think that what's more constructive, if people wanted to bring people back into veganism, would just be like offer ways that might solve their problems, or offer evidence against their new position. I don't really see the value in criticizing people's previous positions or criticizing their honesty about certain positions. Like, that to me is just either mind reading or it's like a fact claim that's just sort of not substantiated. And so I don't see any value there.
Okay, next question, I guess. Why do you think that the majority of vegans are women?
I couldn't tell you. Like, it could be for any number of reasons. Like, we could point to, like, maybe the psychology of women and say that they might have a higher capacity for being appealed to through their sensibilities. And it might be that, slaughter footage just changes their views in ways that it doesn't quite work for men. Or it might be that women are more conscious about their health. But, like, while those would be explanations, they would be ad hoc explanations. And so, like, there's no way for me to test that, or no way for me to say that that's 100% the case. I don't think it's really important to say, like, which gender has more vegans. Just sort of trying to say that like this is like a feminine position. Like there's no real good reason to say that either. It's just all you're saying is it's more likely for people who are feminine to hold this position. But it's more likely for example, like men to hold like a conservative position, but would we really call conservatism like a masculine position? And I think if anyone's going to answer yes there, we'll have a debate sometime, because I think I can push you off that position.
Maybe we could work that into some debate in the future, perhaps.
Could I tell you my opinion?
Of course you can. Go ahead.
Okay, because I am an activist. I do outreach on the streets, and in my experience, I tend to gravitate more towards women to do outreach to. I think women are a little bit more receptive to the idea of compassion, for one, and then for guys, here's what I think. All right, because in my experience, like I said, when I first began this journey, it was for health, like straight up. It wasn't for the animals. I gotta let my dog in. Come on, Willie. All right, so. Yeah, I was doing it for health, and I remember somebody, because I worked in the kitchen, and I was sitting there eating lentils, and this guy goes, "Hey, French, what the fuck, are you vegan now?" And I go, "No, I just like plants." You know what I mean? Because there's a stigma attached to the word vegan, and guys, we have like this, or stereotype of guys, we're supposed to be these like manly fucking, we eat meat and work, got trucks and blah, blah, blah. This crap that I don't subscribe to that. I don't subscribe to that women have to be this way and men have to be that way. We've grown beyond that.
That's a very good perspective, Mike. I agree with you all the way. So,
Bryn.
Oh, go ahead.
I just want to lastly say one last thing to Bryn. I hope you'll call me Mike.
Okay, I can call you Mike.
All right, thank you. I'm gonna go. It was good to be here.
Oh, okay. Hearing from you always.
See you soon.
Thanks.
Nice listening to you, Mike.
Okay, so I'm Bryn. I have a question. What would you say to somebody who has literally no knowledge about, like, what if they wanted to try it out and they had literally no knowledge? What would you tell them?
So the 22-day challenge is probably like the best bet. It's a website where certified nutritionists and dietitians will correspond with you over email or instant messenger and help you out for effectively an entire month on building a lifestyle centered around veganism, or at least like increasing like how plant-based your diet is. And then for like the other questions, I think that there are there's good YouTube channels on addressing the ethical problems. I think there's good channels on addressing the environmental problems. But it sort of has to be relative to their background on these topics. Like, if someone who's like 14 comes up to me and starts talking to me about veganism, I'm not going to pull out like the IPCC report on like 1.5 degrees of warming and start going through like all the scientific literature on going vegan in respect to the environment like I might with someone who can understand that stuff. Same with like ethical arguments. Like there's certain people who can have like really high level philosophical discussions with regard to ethics, but most of the time you just sort of don't need to do that. You can sort of just ask them what their current ethical view is and see how veganism applies to that. And if they want to ask questions later on, that's fine. They're more than available to do that. The things that I would point to first and foremost, though, right, is just that like 22-day challenge, or just point them to like position papers from dietetics and nutritionists on going vegan, just to show that it is at least possible. And if it's possible and they can, follow the lifestyle in a meaningful way as just being a plant-based individual, then they can sort of over time come to accept certain aspects like environmentalism or the animal liberation view.
Right, thank you. And what do you think about people's bias towards killing animals that are such as cows and pigs, opposed to pets like dogs and cats and fish, things like that? What do you think about people's bias?
Yeah, I mean, those are just like institutional norms. Like, those are just the things that are true of our society. But it's not true of just our society, right? Like, there are societies where dogs and cats get eaten, where cows are not eaten, and so on and so forth. And so that view is sort of just speciesist, which, while it sounds like this really like terrible view, like, I think they just sort of have to be able to justify why they view some species differently. And for a lot of people, their answer is just basically going to be, that's just how I was raised. And that's how I was raised is what's called a descriptive answer. So it doesn't really inform us of anything. It just informs us that that is the case. What we're more interested in an ethical argument is why that should be the case.
Right, and I think that a lot of people are raised with cats and dogs like that, so they kind of understand that they have, dogs and cats have more of a consciousness than other animals. People don't experience relationships with a lot of other animals like cats and dogs, especially, and things like cows, as you said, because, and that's the reason why they're kind of biased against it, because obviously a lot of people are biased against a lot of things they don't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, like, I think, again, you can probably construct a worldview, right, where we still view cats and dogs above things like cows. It's just we have to make a case for why it's okay to kill cows. We don't have to do it relatively. We can just do it, like, on a case-by-case basis. Like, why should it be okay to kill this organism? We don't have to say, like, I think the argument's sort of like, you don't eat cats and you don't eat dogs, so why do you eat cows? Is just sort of a vacuous question. Like, it doesn't really mean anything. What's more interesting to me is saying, just in a vacuum, why should we be able to eat cows? And that question's interesting to me.
Yeah, and also there's this thing kind of, I know maybe it might not be much to say about it, offend people, but
it's okay, we're not afraid to be offensive.
A lot of people go off of veganism, a part of their religion, actually, and some people condemn it because of. And what do you think about people who just be vegans off of religion, or people not be?
My sort of hot take on that is that I think, like, for example, certain religions that call for things like animal sacrifice, I think that, like, I'd be okay with even calling those people vegan if they limited their killing to things like sacrifices. Like, I don't really see any problem with that. Like, how am I going to argue with them that a sacrifice is wrong in any meaningful way? Like, I might be able to run arguments against the religion, but if I don't do that and we just take for granted that their religion is correct, or that I don't have any objective answers against their religion, then why would I argue that that's wrong? All I would say is, to what degree can you become vegan, or to what degree are you obligated to be vegan in accordance with their religion? And so, for example, in the Christian case, there's some arguments based on what's written in Genesis and in Mark, that mercy towards animals is probably justified. And I would just sort of repeat that case with any religion, where it's just like, to what degree are you obligated, and to what degree are you doing things that cause harm? Now, certain religions will say that animals are just philosophical zombies, and there's nothing wrong being done there. I don't really think that there's a clear argument against that position, other than to address the religion itself. And so that's a completely different argument, I think. I don't see why that person wouldn't be vegan or wouldn't be acting vegan-esque with respect to their religion in that case, though.
Right, because I don't mean to like put a different topic in here, but I'm a Christian myself, and I like to go by the Bible kind of a diet. Early on in the Bible, they would like have sacrifices, but apparently that's not needed now because the whole.
Yeah, I mean.
Yeah, and people don't sacrifice animals anymore, obviously. But it is encouraged in the Bible to actually plant-based things, and to actually not eat, like when I don't remember his name, the dude was in the prison, and the other people were getting sick, and he would start like plant-based stuff, and everybody felt. So I think based off of religion, a lot of people like to eat vegan and things like that, but they don't really understand of like ethics. They just go off with their religion.
Well, like religion would provide a basis for ethics, right? Like ethics isn't this thing that is separate from religion most of the time. Like religion commands some form of ethics. And so for in the case where like a religion says that certain sacrifices are necessary, then that might be the case that is what they have to justify in their form of veganism. Like it would just be plant-based diet plus sacrifices. And unless you're going to address the religion specifically, which is like probably something you can do, like unless you're going to do that, it's just going to be the case that that will be their form of veganism, and there's no real good argument against that. That's just within their subjective frame. That's what veganism is.
Okay, I have a question which is somewhat light-hearted, but there is a point behind it which I'm pretty confident Bryn will appreciate. As someone who has spent quite a long time on the veganism versus, I'm going to call it non-veganism debate, so to speak, I spent possibly an unhealthy amount of time reading the comment sections under YouTube videos and various forums and things like that. And I would assume that you're familiar with the two-word phrase, bacon though?
Yeah.
Have you ever heard anybody present that as a serious argument?
Yeah. I mean, it's fairly frequent, right? Like, the most serious you can take it is sort of just to reject morality, period. So you can take on what's called like a moral error theorist or like a moral non-cognitivist approach, which is just that there is no such thing as moral facts, or that if there are moral facts, that they're all wrong. And then from there, all you're really doing is operating with respect to your pleasures, to your desires, and to your beliefs. And so I've had it legitimately presented to me that, you know, bacon being tasty is in and of itself the justification for eating bacon. And at that point, it just becomes a meta-ethical debate. Like there's nothing you can really say there. Like all they're doing is rejecting ethics. And so there's no ethical argument to be had.
Sure. The only reason that I was asking it is because, as someone, once again, who has, you know, spent a lot of time on this, I've only ever seen somebody say, but my bacon, once. And that was very, very recently on Talk Heathen. I haven't, and I don't even know how serious Noah was being there. I don't know if you saw that episode or not. But I've never seen it anywhere else, and yet non-vegans get accused of making this argument, well, pretty much non-stop.
I think one thing I would say is it appears to be an intuitive answer. I think what a lot of vegans confuse, though, is that the people aren't making that as an ethical answer, they're making it as a motivation, right? So it's like they could agree with veganism, but they're not going to be motivated because bacon tastes good. And I think vegans have to discern between those two types of answers.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough. It's just that, I mean, I'm not going to rattle on about this forever, but I don't think that anybody in this server who is not a vegan would make that argument. They wouldn't say, "Oh, but bacon, though."
I'll make
so
it.
I kind of, you want to make it? Oh yeah, well, okay. Then
I'd make that argument.
I'll hit the bacon though.
All right, well,
Sure.
go ahead then, because this is Bryn's time. This is.
It just happens to be that the two people who I've met recently who are moral error theorists and who think bacon tastes good happen to be in this chat at the same time.
Okay,
this isn't a very good sample. Yeah, the two people who typed up just happen to be moral error.
All right, it's just from my own personal experience, because, when you read comments under videos and stuff, and then you read the other comments, the replies to those comments and stuff, I've just never seen it. And as someone who spent a stupid amount of time reading these comments and stuff, and really trying to get deep into it, I haven't seen that presented as anything resembling a counter-argument to veganism. So I'm just wondering where vegans are seeing this, I guess.
I would say, in all my time debating on, AY and stuff, I've maybe had it presented as a real ethical argument, maybe, 5 times at most. It's very infrequent, and people tend to get off the position very quickly. Mm-hmm. I think vegans, you're right, they meme responses that they might not be very frequent, but they're the worst of the worst level arguments, because
sure,
it's just a very naive view to say that bacon, though, is a justification in and of itself for most people. Most people haven't thought through the implications of that view for very long. But you're right, I don't think most people use that argument. I think most people have other arguments that are a lot more valid and sound.
Yeah, and I mean, that's what I hear. I don't hear people saying, "Oh, but bacon, what about bacon?" I mean, I just don't hear that, and I've tried my best to find it, and I've failed in finding it. So maybe I'm just not looking in the right places or something, but I've looked everywhere that's available to me, and I'm just not seeing it. So I think it might, not that you do this, I wouldn't accuse you for a second, but I think it might be a bit disingenuous of vegans to be coming up with, "Oh, this is the carnist argument, but bacon, though." I mean, I just don't think that's what happens on any scale worth talking about. Perhaps you get some dumbasses that are going to make that, argument, if we're going to call it an argument, but I don't think it's very common. But yeah, back to those people who wanted to make those arguments, I guess.
Yeah,
I was just memeing. I wouldn't get, my go-to argument isn't, "But what about bacon?" Because obviously that's not really going to hit with a vegan.
No, it won't.
The argument for bacon, though, would only been.
It's actually gone to. Sorry, I promise I'll be quiet in just a second. But it's actually got to the point where I see this so often in the online vegan community that we actually have a channel here, which, if you roll as a carnist, you get access to a channel called Bacon Though, which is intended to be deliberately fucking stupid, but it's kind of a piss take, because I just don't see anybody seriously presenting this as an argument.
I think one thing I would say is it's a semi-frequent just joke that gets delivered to vegans in person. So when you're having a conversation with your friends or family members, it can be said here and there. But you're right, I don't think it's ever presented in a serious way. It's just always sort of just an innate response that people have, and I think that's why it's more of a point towards their motivations and less of a point towards their reasons.
So it's almost a straw man in that sense, then.
I would say so.
Yeah, fair enough, no problem. Okay, anybody else? Go ahead.
If an action is justified, then that means it's something you ought to do. I desire to eat bacon, therefore I ought to eat bacon. Therefore I'm justified in eating bacon.
Right. You and I aren't having a meta-ethical debate right now.
Okay.
Yeah, this isn't a debate. We're not grilling Bryn. Bryn was gracious enough to come here for an AMA, so we're asking him serious questions.
Well, no, Bryn agrees with me.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So Finn, you had something, I think?
I just wanted to put the way that I try and differentiate dogs between cows is a kind of social contract kind of thing, which is how I have had relationships or social contracts with dogs, and or people that I care about have had that, and that's how I would differentiate it. I'm not saying that I can't have that with cows. I'm just saying that I haven't, so I don't care about them.
Mm-hmm. That's like a descriptive fact. So like that's a good account of why you haven't yet, thought about veganism, or you currently kill cows, and I think I'm fine with that. What's a more interesting conversation to me is why we should consider the social contract when we make ethical decisions, or why we should consider cows to not be a part of the social contract, or why if a cow isn't a part of a social contract and we agree that the social contract has some value in our ethical decisions, why we should still kill cows when we know for a fact that there are these other things that might matter. And that's sort of what I was. So basically, what I was talking about earlier with like value pluralism, right? Right. There's a couple stages that you have to go through. The first one is you have to justify why a social contract would matter, and then you have to justify why cows are not or cannot be part of the social contract prescriptively, and then you also have to sort of justify why, even if those two things are true, why the other things don't matter.
Well, they don't matter to me. I'm not saying they don't matter objectively.
Okay, I mean, that if that's a question of like motivations or a question of subjective views, then that's just like a thing we would debate on or discuss later.
Yeah, it all comes down to
that might be the case, right?
Mine all comes down to just a meta-ethical discussion, I guess. That probably doesn't.
Yeah, that's fair. Like a lot of vegans hate when I go into like these meta-ethical discussions, but I think that they're useful sometimes. Like there are positions where vegans are trying to have they try to speak to the room rather than to the person they're debating, and so they think that they get these like reductios, right, where they say like, well, look at this guy here, all he cares about is the social contract, but it leads to this reductio, and that's absurd. But it's kind of unclear what they mean by that. I think what would be a more interesting discussion for vegans to be having in that situation is to argue why that is absurd and sort of what the other options are that are available.
Why is it absurd? I don't know.
That's what I mean, is like vegans will get you to that point where they say, well, anyone would find this view absurd, but it's unclear if that's actually the case, and it's unclear whether that's the case.
Yeah, that's what Ask Yourself said to me, and then I said I didn't have a problem with it, and then he kicked me from the server.
Yeah, I think at that point, like the question is no longer about sort of what your view gets reduced to. It's the question about like why you should care about it, and I think that the vegans should get better at giving an account of why certain things should matter and why certain things shouldn't matter. You can get to any one position just logically, but then there has to be this other discussion about, what does this position entail emotionally? What does this position entail in terms of a whole bunch of things? And I think a lot of vegans are really bad at that. They're really good at running the script to get you to a reductio, but there's this other side that they're really weak on. Like you said, like at that point they either just kick you or they just say, well, I'm just appealing to the room now. I'm not appealing to you anymore. And that's kind of that's a weak way out, I think.
Because Ask Yourself just basically got to the point where he'd asked all the questions, and then he was like, well, you believe something that I don't believe. You would say this is moral in this scenario, and I think that this is a psychopathic thing, so therefore I'm just going to kick you and call you a retard and yell at you.
Yeah, so, I'm not here
so you're not a fan of Ask Yourself in that way.
I'm not here to talk about Ask Yourself's conduct in any meaningful way. Like I think it's his server, so he's justified in what he does there. But just personally, like my view is that if people are going to run the NTT script and then they're going to get to the point where they finished running the NTT script and they get to a reductio, as they're going to call it, they still have to give an account of why that reductio matters. And that is a really interesting conversation that I think a lot of vegans are really bad at.
Do you think that reductios would be like a lot better at convincing people if the reductios were like some in a scenario where you like drew an analogy to like dogs or cats or something, right? Because those are like currently things that are like happening, right? So for someone to bite the bullet, it just seems like it would take like a bigger like toll on someone and to be like a bigger like appeal to their sensibilities, right? For them to have to bite the bullet and like eating dogs being justified, right? Because that's something that's actually happening, right? Just like a few borders away from them. And it just seems like, right, like what I'm just saying is it seems really easy to bite the bullet on some alien like me, right? Just like that. So yeah, if aliens came down, blah, 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 sure, I'll bite the bullet, right? It's just really hard to imagine anyone would be convinced by that, right? Even in the alien reductios, I really don't think that most people would be convinced one way or the other by these alien reductios, right? But it just seems like if you appeal to like, you know, like dogs or cats or something, that could go like a long way.
Well, it's usually what I do, right? Like for example, in a lot of these scenarios, it gets down to the point where their view justifies drowning cats. And so you have to get them to sit there and sort of explain to you why it would be okay for them to go and take their cat and just drown it. And you do all sorts of appeals to sensibilities, right? Like a very popular one is just to show people Dominion or stills from Dominion and say, like, why is this scenario justified? Or like you said, just running reductios in respect to like their mother is another fun one. Like things that people, you're right, that you can do the appeal to sensibilities and just see once they really have an emotional attachment to the question, whether or not it holds up. And certainly people can answer those questions dishonestly, but I think even if they're answering it dishonestly, it gives them something to think about and something to come back and talk about at a later date. Another way to address those concerns is to give them motivations in the direction of veganism that are like positive. So you can say like, this is how easy veganism is. These are the sort of benefits you can get, and you can appeal to those sort of sensibilities as well.
Yeah, that seems like the most convincing thing to me, right? Just like, because you can go on like hours and hours, right, regarding some like ethical stuff, right? But it just seems like when someone, right, the things that are like hard for me to like, you know, really like respond to, right, where like I'll even like concede that the vegan might have a point, right? It's just when they appeal to like how little of a sacrifice it is, right, and like, you know, all the benefits that are like in different like ways. Right, that's like really difficult to like give a response to. Then this like whole thing of like trying to go about convoluted like ethics and shit.
Right,
that's like more effective to me.
Yeah, like at a certain point, right? Like people can just invoke things like egoism or just like error theory or non-cognitivism, and they just like nope out of the ethical debate. Or they can just say, yeah, I'm fine with that reductio. And at that point, it's like a lot of vegans just don't know how to deal with that. And at that point, you're really just having a conversation of motivations. And I think that's a conversation vegans need to get better at.
Welcome, Jack Angstrike, to the chat. Did you have a question for Bryn?
Did I?
Yeah, I noticed you joined. Did you have a question for Bryn? Because he's doing Ask Me Anything session.
No.
As you were. Anybody else have a question for Bryn?
Yeah, you go.
No, I'm sorry. No, I cut you off last time ago.
With the alien thing, are you referring to like if aliens came down and looked at our civilization, what would they think? Is that kind of the gist of it? Or...
Yeah, well, it goes a step further, right? So like sometimes people will use arguments about how we view like cattle, and they'll say like, you know, for example, I can't really relate with cattle because their intelligence is different or they look different or stuff like that. And then the question can become, if an alien species that was very different from us came to Earth and had that same view towards us, would you be okay with that? And while the answer, you know, can be shifted into like, well, yeah, they would just be justified in doing that. The attempt there is what's called like an attempt to appeal to sensibilities, where you're saying like, do you really think that you would be okay with being killed just because someone views you differently? But what Manny's saying is that hypothetical is harder to conceptualize than, say, if we ran that hypothetical on, say, cats or dogs or your mother, or like things that we already have some physical manifestation of that we can relate to.
Right. Okay. I'm seeing what you're getting at. Yeah. So yeah, on one hand, I would be like, I would not want them to kill me because I care about myself, but I think that the aliens could use the same logic if they held my moral position to kill vegans.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So I could just flip the aliens' view, and you would seem to be screwed the same way I am.
Mm-hmm. Like that's the thing, right? Like these hypotheticals.
Yes.
Like every position sort of has reductions. Right?
Yes. So
the question is like, how motivating are the reductios? How relatable are the reductios? And like, we sort of just have to have a subjective discussion about the implications of any one of our actions and whether or not we can be motivated by them.
Yeah, I always get confused at why someone would bring up the alien example if it goes against them as well. It's just an argument. If someone came over that didn't like you, would they be justified in killing you? I would say no, except the logic could be sound. I don't know. It doesn't seem very a good argument.
Well, the attempt is not is actually an attack on the soundness. It's that the position might be valid, but it doesn't seem sound because we would sort of reject the argument if it was directed towards us.
Yeah, and I would reject the argument if it was towards me for seemingly similar reasons. I don't.
Mm-hmm. And then, like, the idea is if we wouldn't want aliens doing it to us, then why are we okay when we do it to cows? And that's a question they have to grapple with. Some people will just bite the bullet on like that being like wrong, and then they just say they're not motivated by it, or they might come up with like any list of reasons why it's okay. All Manny is saying is that those sort of scenarios aren't motivating because we can't conceptualize aliens in the same way that we can conceptualize drowning a cat.
Yeah, you made that point right there was the thing that I was really struggling with, the argument of, because I care about dogs. It's, so if someone made the argument to me, why do you care about humans that you've never met before or something, I would go, well, I wouldn't want that happening to me. And then you could put the same with dogs and cows. So I would have to say, sure, except I'm kind of taking a gamble in that I don't think that's going to happen. Like I let it happen because it doesn't. I'm kind of taking a gamble on it. Like I don't think that it's gonna happen really, if that makes any sense. Hello.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if there's a question there or not. Like that would just be your view. I'm not really here today to like get into debate over anything. I respond to a claim.
I got you.
Yeah, that's completely fair enough.
Here's what I want to know. Have you convinced people of veganism? Successfully?
I have like 3 friends in person who I've convinced so far.
Okay, let me ask you this: from other people too, or just like all the people you have seen convinced of veganism. I want to know like what the most common thing has been. So like, is the most common thing like some appeal to like sensibilities and people feeling bad? Is it some like meta, like is it some like hard like ethical philosophical route? Is it like an environmental appeal or a health appeal? Like, what's the most common like reason that you've seen people get convinced of veganism? Which way is the most effective?
Environment and health, for sure.
Oh, actually, I guess the opposite.
Like, moralizing against people is just pretty ineffective, usually, unless people, like, opt into that discussion. Like, walking up to someone and moralizing them just is usually pretty ineffective. But what is kind of effective is giving them like motivational reasons for why they might want to consider the diet. I have one friend who I successfully moralized, and that was through an appeal to sensibilities. So I just had like the basic like NTT discussion with them. It got down to the point where they were just saying, well, like the intellectual differences justify it for me. And then it was as simple as like I convinced them to watch Dominion with me one night, and then it was just a question of like, even if there are intellectual differences, like, do those intellectual differences justify what's happening here? And at that point, they got to the point where they were just saying, like, no, it probably doesn't. And there's all these other reasons to go vegan, so I guess I'll just do it. Most of my friends are idiots, though, so, like, I don't really try to have meta-ethical respect with them ever.
What's the saying? Birds of a feather flock together?
Well, I used to be a STEM lord, right? And so I have a lot of STEM lord friends. And so philosophical discussions with them are really useless.
What the fuck is a STEM lord?
It's sort of just the view that, like, philosophy, for like you know, Vive, right? From, like, intellectuals.
Oh,
like,
cancer.
That's a STEM lord, right? Like, where just science is the only thing that is useful, and philosophy is just this useless concept that people just sit around, like, giving no answers for.
Here to that.
Alright, so I have another question. Why would anyone follow the objective moral values instead of following their own subjective moral values?
They wouldn't. That's just sort of the problem with the moral objectivism. It's just like, this is, I don't know how, like, well, rather how deep you want to get into this, but there's an individual by the name of J.L. Mackey who runs this argument, which is that if morals are real, then they should be what's called internally motivating, which is to say that just because they are real, that they should motivate us to act that way. But that doesn't really seem to be the case, because we have moral disagreement all the time. We have people like psychopaths and murderers and whatnot. And so what's kind of weird is it doesn't really seem to be the case that morals are motivating. It's just that would be like some fact of the universe is that we should act that way. But there's no real good answer to say that in and of itself is motivating, or that we need to follow that. So, like, when I was talking about that earlier, I said, like, I have some preliminary reasons to believe that there is such thing as an objective moral fact, but I don't think that we can come to know them, and I don't think that they're motivating. So I'm much closer to a moral error theorist than not.
Yes.
I'm still very confused about how you get to the objective morality, except I know that you've said that before and I was away for a little bit, so I've lost some words.
There's just some really memey arguments that you can run that appear to show that morality is objective.
Is it that everyone shares the same beliefs? So?
No. There's ontological arguments, and there's also arguments from disagreement and contradictability that say that we kind of would want moral facts to exist there, but they're not conclusive in and of themselves. I think that basically most people, if they think about it for a long time, or if they like listen to the arguments, they're going to lean more closely towards moral anti-realism. And so, like, most people are going to naively be moral subjectivists, but that position has some large problems. A lot of people more contemporaneously are going to be moral expressivists, which is the view that there isn't such thing as moral truths and falses. All it's really us doing is expressing some belief and desire pair. And then there's moral error theorists, which take it another step further and say either all moral facts are wrong, or that we can't know them, or that they wouldn't be motivating. And I think the issue with us learning moral facts and the issue with us being motivated by moral facts is an extremely large problem. It's kind of hard to conceptualize how we might solve that problem. And there's no real good arguments against it yet.
This is Bryn coming up.
Okay, I have one more quick question, and it relates back to the one that I asked earlier, actually. I see a lot of vegans saying that it's inevitable that the whole world will go vegan. Do you agree with that?
I don't know about the whole world, right? Like every problem is like everything's not going to be 100%, but there's a good set of reasons to believe that most people will eventually become vegan. And so one of those things is just that it's unsustainable to be growing meat, at least from what I understand. I think that solutions like lab meat, which are going to undercut the price of meat significantly, will lead to more and more people becoming vegan. I think as more and more people understand or are legislated against in akin to like environmental problems, will lead to more people being vegan. And I think that over time, if the trend in health sciences continues, over time, health recommendations and nutritional recommendations are going to be more and more expressively vegan. So between like the health arguments sort of leading in that direction, the environmental requirements leading in that direction, and just the economic unsustainability of eating meat, I think most people, or at least a significant portion of the population, is going to become vegan.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to imply literally everybody in the world.
Well, and then, so what some people would say there is, like, if you could get, like, 60 to 70% of the world being vegan, then it might just be the case that they legislate against it, right? And so at that point, the only people who wouldn't be vegan would be institutionally criminal. But I'm not totally convinced that we will get there. I just think that it'll end up being something akin to like smoking, where it's just societally frowned upon, and that there's better options available for your health than wallet.
So I think maybe meat eaters would become perhaps ostracized. Maybe, I mean, that might be too strong a word.
Maybe ostracized, or it just like. It would be a tough decision to make, because at a certain point, if lab meat really takes off, it's going to become increasingly pricey to buy real meat. And it might just be like, it's sort of like the same thing as like signing off on doing like smoking tobacco, right? Where it's like, you have to understand that you're really doing a great disservice to your health to continue eating meat versus the alternatives. Or
I actually quit smoking yesterday.
Well, congratulations. I hope it works out for you. Are you like going with like a vape or something?
No, cold turkey.
Wow, good luck.
Oof, yeah, I'm going to need it, but thank you. No, I was just wondering if you thought maybe, because like you brought up smoking, I was wondering if you thought maybe it would become like, what we do. I don't want to say ostracized, actually. I want to say something else. Perhaps just frowned upon, maybe.
Ostracized is like the technical word. I think we just put a lot of like value on that word that we maybe should. Like, it would just be like, it would be ostracized in the sense that like, less and less people will do it. It'll probably be that restaurants stop serving meat, stuff like that. But I don't think it's just going to be like people will reject you from society. It's just like the concept of eating meat will be less and less popular.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess that's why I wasn't too keen. I heard as soon as I said the word ostracized, I thought, that's probably not the word I wanted to use.
Yeah, I think the basis of the argument is going to become increasingly difficult to not be vegan. As far as I understand the situation to be.
Okay. Thank you.
Bryn, do you share like my intuition that like vegans are gonna go on to be seen as like the people that were on like the right side of history, as it were? Like, you know, like a century or so from now.
At least very convincingly, I think, with the health and environmental aspects. The ethical aspects, like, I don't want to make any strong claims there. I think, like, at least subjectively, they might be, right? Like, I think as more and more people understand the implications of factory farming and they're less motivated by the health claims, any amount of cognitive dissonance there might evaporate. But I'm not certain how much cognitive dissonance does exist in the world. Like, I think some people have very good reasons to justify their eating meat, and it's not just cognitive dissonance. It's just they actually have reasons and motivations. So I wouldn't make any strong claims with regards to that. I just think that, like, over time we might view it as weird that we put our planet at like that much harm if we can survive what's sort of happening right now.
Gotcha.
Just out of curiosity, what are your personal reasons for being vegan?
I think that there's a hazard to eating it on an ethical level. I think that there is enough evidence of animal consciousness and animal minds that the sort of rights that I extend to other human minds, I'm also willing to extend to animals. I think that the health arguments, although not as clinically strong, which is to say that like veganism isn't going to give you superpowers, but there's definitely reasons to believe that veganism is at least nutritionally adequate and maybe a little bit more healthy than omnivory. So I follow like the health arguments. The biggest thing that I'm concerned about is sort of the environmental argument. And so there's some clear evidence coming out. Like there's a paper that came out last week that showed, for example, that if we just cut meat out of our diet, that in and of itself would give us a very good starter at making sure that we can avoid sort of the global warming catastrophe that is going on right now. And so I think that for me would be the biggest selling feature. But that there's also these other risks that I would be taking with regards to animal rights and my own health to not be vegan. And it's easy enough for me to go vegan that it's just like that I have no reason not to be.
Okay.
So how would you respond, if I might just cut in one more time, how would you respond to somebody who can demonstrate that it's easier for them to not be vegan than be vegan? I appreciate that I asked you this earlier, it's just this is a slightly different way of wording the question.
Right. So it's to degrees, right? Like I'm big on like soft abolition. So it's like just slowly shifting over the things that you can shift. And so I understand that for some populations in the world, like the Inuit, for example, just take an extreme case. Like I'm not going to say that the Inuit can be vegan tomorrow. What I would say is that they just have reasons to consider changing their lifestyle, that they should change it as much as possible. But but that's just like on a that's on a principle level. I think that there's this really interesting discussion about motivations that sort of gets lost on a lot of vegans. And I think you just have to understand that while some people won't be able to principally justify their veganism, there's this other idea like motivations that most vegans are just never going to be able to overcome. And what vegans should attempt to do is try to make the vegan lifestyle as easy for others as possible, or as enjoyable as possible for others. And so things like funding mock meat and lab meat development is one way that they can go about doing that. Harboring like good relationships with the non-vegan community is probably another one. And funding like the development and research into the health and environmental arguments is probably another one.
Fair enough. So, I mean, one more very, very small point on that, because you've been vegan for, I think it was 11 months, you said, was that right?
Yeah.
Do you miss it?
At this point, no. And I think I'm being honest about that. Like, I
thought you would be. That's why I thought it was okay to ask you.
Like, there are times, right, where I feel like I miss aspects of it, but I live in the first world where it's easy for me to get a lot of these, like, supplementary products. Like, for example, like, I can get cheese that is just overwhelmingly similar. I can get meats that are just overwhelmingly similar. And so there's not really much for me to miss for it. I think if I was in, like, a lower economic status, or if I was in, the third world or something, there would be aspects that I would miss. Like, there would be novelty and luxury that I would miss there. And so I can kind of understand that. But for me personally, no, there's not much about it that I miss.
You'd say you're probably over it then. Would that be a fair way to summarize it?
Mm-hmm. I think like the one thing I maybe miss is, like, and this is kind of funny, is probably just bacon. Like lamb to me, for example, like I actually find the scent and like side of it gross. Chicken for me is gross now. Beef is gross for me now, but definitely like bacon, I can still like when I'm around it being cooked, like I can definitely miss it.
Yeah,
because there's no good bacon substitute. I will be very open about that. Like, vegan bacon is miserable.
The power of bacon compels you.
Nah, fair enough. That was very honest. So, anybody have any further questions for Bryn? I mean, I don't know how long Bryn wants to keep going for, but if anybody has some questions while we've got him here, then fire away.
I'm out of questions.
Oh, all right. So the main question is, when will you be quitting veganism, and how do you see it going?
Whoa! You're making an assumption there that he will be quitting veganism, and I don't think he's given us any indication of that.
Well, I think what I might be able to do that might be more fair to your intention is to set the bar for like how I might end this diet. And so,
yeah,
one thing I would say is, like, if SD could demonstrate to me that I am doing more harm in terms of deaths or in terms of suffering, like, that would be a good bar to set. Or if it could be demonstrated to me that there's, like, to some subjective threshold that I'm not really aware of, like, where I would lay it, that it's doing a harm to my health, then I would probably quit it. Like, for example, like, if it was the case that drinking acetone, like, saved animal lives, I'm not sure that I would drink acetone. I think I like living a little bit. But that might just be a motivational question.
Okay, so as you mentioned me there, would you be willing to have that conversation? Not right now, obviously, because that's not what we came here to do, but would you be willing to perhaps entertain me on that notion sometime?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I'm on most nights to debate, and so pretty much whenever it works, right? Like, I prefer these sort of weekend times. I think if we were going to do that, I'd bring people over here too. I'm going to have it over here, and then we'll bring, like, some of the people from, like, Ask Yourself over here, and we can make it a big thing. But I'm definitely down to have that conversation.
I wouldn't be able to do it over there because I'm banned in common with...
No, I mean, we can come over here, right? So
Yeah, I know. I heard what you said. It's just it would have to be here rather than over there because I'm banned anyway, as is probably half this server or more. But yeah, I mean, I'd be definitely willing to do that with you for certain.
I don't like cowering in my veganism. I am very much open to these novel arguments.
Well, that's very clear.
Especially if they can be presented with, like, really good evidence. Like, I'm super open to that.
Excellent. That's about as honest as you could possibly be. So I definitely tip my cap to you for that. Sorry to interrupt your questions, Denise. I did cut you off there. My bad.
I think it sort of sounds like it. Like, I think I'm gonna head out in a little bit here. I think I'll entertain, like, one or two more questions.
Sure.
But I'm always down.
It's 9:10 here. Could we go until 5:30 and then cut it off?
Sure, that sounds good for me.
Perfect.
A follow-up question I have is, I guess, in an attempt to determine how long you might last, is how many calories do you eat usually?
Well, right now I'm trying to lose weight, so I'm down to 1,700 calories a day. If I'm trying to maintain weight like I was up until, like, the beginning of this week, I'd be having, like, 2,500 calories a day. If I'm gaining weight, I'd be having upwards of, like, 4,000 to 5,000 calories a day. And so it sort of depends, but calories are pretty cheap. Like, you can just add pasta and rice, and it's not really a concern.
What is your weight and height in metric system, if possible?
I'm 93 kilos right now, and I am 183 centimeters.
That's actually quite high, surprisingly.
Well,
I'm more or less where you are.
Yeah, the highest I was ever was 120 kilos.
So, were you just fat, or did you get? You're lagging. Where are you in good shape right now?
Well, for reference, I deadlifted 650 pounds, which is just around like 300 and some kilos. And I can bench press just around 150 kilos. So I consider myself like at risk for things like cardiovascular problems because I carry around a lot of weight, but like my body fat percentage is just in around like 18% right now.
All right, man. I got a question.
Go ahead.
Will I have sex with my wife, Bryn?
No.
Come on, man. She needs some TLC.
I mean, I think that you can give that to her.
No,
Okay, I have a question.
Right, he's server muted because you didn't come here for that, so...
Yeah, that was bizarre.
Hey, that's not nice. Man. Be nice.
What is your view on fruitarians in terms of, health, like health-wise? Do you think that... Well, I'm not a fruitarian, actually. I'm a vegan, but I see, like, a lot of people pushing forward the raw vegan diet and fruitarianism.
I think it's dumb to like put it bluntly. Like there's no evidence that those diets confer any benefits. Mm-hmm. In fact, there's evidence to the contrary, right? So, for example, in raw veganism, one of the big things with veganism is our bodies don't. We can't actually process cellulose in any meaningful way. And so what cooking does is it helps break down cellulose so that we can extract nutrients. And so cooking does confer a big benefit for vegans. There's also anti-nutrients that get broken down in cooking. So, for example, pretty much every legume, if you were to eat legumes raw, it's going to be pretty bad for you because a lot of the anti-nutrients that are inherently in them are not going to be cooked away, and you're going to start suffering nutritional deficiencies over time. Okay. When it comes to fruitarianism, it's a lot of sugar. And
that's what I thought.
There's kind of this meme amongst vegans that like fructose from fruit is different from fructose from other sources, and that's not really the case. Like there's a benefit to having more fiber in your diet and how that relates to hyperglycemia and hypoglycemia shifts, but it's still an obscene amount of sugar that fruitarians are consuming. And so there's so far not very much long-term evidence, but the evidence that has come out so far against fruitarianism shows that they are at an increased risk of forms of diabetes and other disorders just because of the amount of fruit sugar that they're taking in. There's also the issue that a fruit-based diet probably isn't getting you enough protein, and it probably isn't getting you enough iron, and it probably isn't getting you enough potassium, and it definitely isn't getting you enough selenium. And so those are things that they have to deal with as well, which they could deal with a supplement. So they could just be having like protein supplements, they could just be having like multivitamins. But I think their argument is that it's healthier, and it's just not the case. Like there's just no evidence to support that. Maybe they prefer a diet like that, and they could just have higher amounts of fruit. But there's good reasons to believe that we should be cooking our food, and there's good reasons to believe that we should be having things like root vegetables and leafy greens and legumes and whatnot. There's also really good evidence in favor of increased fat consumption. Like monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats are things that vegans are very weak in consuming, and they need to consume more. Like there's a lot of evidence for that, especially monounsaturated fats. Things like vitamin D are what's called a fat-soluble vitamin, and these sort of diets that are extremely low in fat, they're not going to be able to absorb or even handle that much vitamin D in their body. And if that's the case, then they're going to have a lot of problems with their endogenous endocrine system, because vitamin D is what's responsible for things like testosterone and estrogen and progesterone management. And so if you're not having much vitamin D, or your body is just not having that much fat, those systems are going to suffer. And that can lead to the sort of long-term consequences that we see in veganism. sort of any time that like someone makes like a health claim about a diet, what you want to do is just ask them to provide like medical evidence. And so epidemiological studies or random control trials are pretty good places to start. And those just don't exist for raw food or fruitarian diets.
Thank you for your answer. I think Bryn has roughly 15 minutes left, maybe just a minute less than that. Does anybody else have any questions for Bryn before he leaves? Don't all talk at once.
Well, I think, SD, I think you muted Galeem client side and not server side, because he's still talking.
Yeah, he's gibbering on. I can't do anything about that. He's muted himself.
There's a link in the bacon bow that answers your question.
I think if that's a serious question, you should probably just drink more water.
So I would like to. It's not really a question, but I would like to say that I was curious about vitamin D absorption and how much fat you need to eat with it. It turns out that although eating vitamin D supplements with fat does help absorption, it's like something like 30% more absorption according to the studies I looked at. So even if your food does not have fat, you can eat these fat-soluble vitamins, and some of it will get absorbed. So it's not a huge deal.
No, it isn't a huge deal, but there are other fat-soluble vitamins, and there's also processes that use monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats in the body. And so these diets that are just extremely high in carbs and whatnot, try to minimize fat intake across the board, they're doing a great disservice to their health. There's a lot of reasons to believe that saturated fat is bad, but there's also a lot of reasons to believe that monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats are good. And so I'm a big advocate of presenting the evidence that we should be having an increased amount of monounsaturated fat, which you can get from things like olive oil or avocados in abundance.
Okay, I have a very basic question. What is your favourite plant milk and why?
So I've gone through all of them. I think cashew milk is my favorite, just because I like the nutritional profile and it's got a pretty neutral taste. I think unlike most vegans, I really dislike almond milk. To me, it tastes extremely watery. It tastes extremely watery. Like I don't know why people like it. There's just no flavor there, and it just sort of has this weird taste to it. Soy milk's pretty good too, but it's pretty high in like calories and stuff. And so I'm a big fan of cashew milk because it's got the most like neutral, like somewhat close to milk taste out there, while still having like a really good nutritional profile. Probably the best like luxury milk though is like Ripple milk made from peas, and then made with like chocolate. I'm a big chocolate milk fan, and so chocolate Ripple milk is like probably the best, but it's like 3 to 4 times more expensive than cashew and soy and almond milk here, so I don't buy it that very often.
Oh, okay. I've never heard of Ripple milk actually.
It's really popular. It's pretty much like only in the States.
Oh, okay.
It's slowly spreading out to like Canada and maybe into Europe over time. Whereas in comparison, oat milk is like really dominant in Europe. but it's like not at all in North America. But oat milk is really good. I'm a big fan of oat milk.
Any final questions for Bryn before he has to leave? 9 minutes close.
Do you have any recommendations for vegan food? What's a good starting vegan food?
Are you looking for like recipes or like convenience
anything?
foods?
Good taste that will make me think, wow, this tastes amazing, I'm going to go vegan.
That's an interesting question.
Well, the biggest thing that I would recommend people try out is what's called seitan, and so it's spelled Seitan, and it's made from the protein that's found in wheat. And because it's a proteinous substance, it kind of cooks up into the same texture as chicken and beef, but it's really absorbent, and so you can cook it in a lot of sauces. So I'd try and find somewhere in your town that serves seitan.
Okay, I'll buy it.
And then products from Gardein, they're junk food, but they're really good. The other thing too that I would recommend trying is seeing if you can find the Beyond Burger or the Impossible Burger in your city, and going and trying that, because those are both vegan, and they're kind of impressively similar to meat. The Beyond Burger is very similar to like a McDonald's or like a low quality burger. It's got that like greasy taste that makes you love it when you're having it, and then you like hate yourself afterwards, which is kind of cool. And then the Impossible Burger is like closer to like more of like a restaurant or like home style burger. So it's got just like a solid like meaty taste to it.
Okay.
I actually would be up for trying an Impossible Burger, but I'm not aware that it's available here. I mean, Finn, you're in the same country as me. Is it available anywhere where you are?
I'm pretty sure it is available to buy. I don't know. Have you seen that video of Jeremy Clarkson eating one?
I have not, actually.
I don't know. I was assuming that it's available because he's from around here, so...
Oh, okay.
Unless he was eating in America while he was doing the Grand Tour, I'm assuming it's available.
Wait, which one are you talking about? The Beyond Meat Burger?
Yeah.
I think they sell it in Tesco.
Do they?
I think so.
Okay. Because I'm actually really interested to try that, to compare it to put this to the test and see how it tastes.
I've also posted a specific YouTube channel in general chat and VC chat, and that's probably the best. That's like the best vegan cooking channel I think I know of. All the recipes there, they're actually surprisingly simple to do if you're a fan of cooking, but they're all extremely good. Like this guy is pretty insane with his capacity for creating vegan recipes, and he has a lot of like mock meat tutorials and a lot of tofu tutorials and a lot of legume tutorials, since a lot of people have problems switching out their protein. I'd look at his seitan tutorial. He's got a really good one about seitan steak that I would take a look at.
Okay, yeah, we see those. Thank you for posting them. I think I'm just gonna, before you go, because 6 minutes left, call out Galeem, because he said he had like 12 questions for you, so maybe we can allow him for one.
Okay, yeah. Very important question.
Galeem, would you like to unmute yourself and go ahead with your question for Bryn? And please do not.
I think you've got him. I think you've got him client muted.
No, I unmuted him about 2 minutes ago.
I'm talking though. Yeah. Okay. One really big question, Brent. Why are literally every single vegan that I've met so freaking
He's
weird?
muted on his end. It's not
no, I'm not.
He's just asking troll questions.
No, I'm not. This is a really good question. I'm serious right now.
Okay, can I just chime in here? Piss off, Galeem.
Yeah, alright, he's serving muted again. Sorry about that. I thought maybe...
So Galeem and I actually have like a history. He likes to do this a lot.
Okay.
So...
Alright, I'm not familiar with the guy, so...
He's a well-known troll from pretty much every vegan Discord. He is vegan.
Is this his way of banter?
He is
Wait, he's
vegan.
a vegan?
Yeah, he is vegan. He really likes to disrupt everything.
All right. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I thought for a second that he had a genuine question, but apparently that's not the case. So now he's silenced for everybody. So at this point, Bryn, I do want to thank you for popping over here. You said that you would, and you have turned up, and you've answered everybody's questions, and you are definitely a nice guy as far as I'm concerned. So thank you for coming.
Well, thank you for hosting me and sending out the announcement. I think all the questions were really good. I think the people I talked to, I've been meaning to talk to for a while, so it was nice to finally pop in and see some of these people. I think hopefully we can set up that debate in the future.
Yeah, I would definitely be interested in doing that. You can hit me up in DM or in the server whenever you like. Not a problem at all. That was definitely one of the more interesting exchanges that we've had with vegans, because you didn't dodge anything. You answered all the questions that everybody asked you. And I can only say, brilliant. Well done. That's quite refreshing.
Well, thank you. It was nice talking to all of you guys as well. I'll definitely be around, and feel free to at me if anyone else has any more questions. Yeah, thanks for hosting me.
Not a problem at all, man. Come back anytime you want.
Okay, bye.
All right, see you later. That's a nice guy.
Vegans.
Yeah, but he's a nice guy.
No, he was a really nice guy. I think he was the first guy that I ever spoke to in Ask Yourself. And then my conversation with him was interrupted to be moved into a debate server, and then
fuck yourself. Yeah. I know, that's what he likes to do. I mean, Bryn is different. He's, well, at least so far, anyway, he's been in this server for a long time, and I don't think he's anything like Ask Yourself.
What is Ask Yourself?
Are you not familiar with Ask Yourself?
I am not.
Oh, dear me. And you're a vegan?
I am.
And
why? Is it pro or anti-vegan?
Oh no, Ask Yourself is very pro-vegan.
He's so pro that he hates everyone that isn't.
Yeah, I mean, we actually have a role here that is banned by Ask Yourself, because everybody gets banned if you even attempt to make a point against veganism, like we did with Bryn, for example. You get banned straight away. Disagree, you get banned.
Oh, interesting.
Whereabouts in the UK are
I
you?
never said anything to you. Remember? I never got. You said that was your first time. Hey, you said that was your first time. They never gave you or whatever, and really that wasn't true, because
I didn't quite follow that point, Mike.
You're saying he's the first one to never dodge, and I never dodged your question. I answered it.
Oh, no, okay, yes, I acknowledge that with you as well. Definitely, 100%.
Right on.
Don't worry, Mike. We got your back, man. So, Rose, whereabouts in the UK are you?
I live in the south, just outside of London.
Just outside of London,
Where are you?
I'm in Wales.
I thought you were. I wasn't certain.
No sheep jokes, right? Shut up. No sheep
No,
jokes.
I don't have it. I don't have one.
It's right. Finn's in the UK as well.
Yeah, it seems like we're...
And Tap.
Well, I used to live very close to the
Got a few Brits in here. But no, I was keen to go ahead with that with Bryn, because he offered, so...
I came